We all know how important it is to get kids reading. Some kids love it, some kids hate it, but how do you even get the kids that love to read what they're supposed to? How much reading is enough? We are here today with expert Karen Emerson, who actually is a reading specialist, has her master's in experiential education and over 20 years of teaching experience. And she is going to talk to us today about getting kids to read. Thanks for coming, Karen.
Absolutely. I think getting kids to read is really the crux of being a good reader. Studies show over and over again that the kids who read most read best.
Okay.
And of course, what do you do with the kids who hate reading? And even the kids who do like reading often choose other things.
Right. Yes. And reading, actually, I think it's just so important because, you know, we've got science and math and all of those things in school, but reading is what really opens up your world. If you can read, you can do almost anything. I mean, and so I think it's just such an important skill for kids to have. And it's also something that can bring so much joy once you finally master the skill. So let's talk about reluctant readers. How can we get them started?
Well, reluctant readers, often a key is to make sure that they're being 95% accurate. And you can do that in a couple of ways. One way is to make sure you're finding books at levels that they can mostly read, where they're only making a few mistakes. Because if you're reading things where you're 95% accurate, then you are understanding the book, you're understanding the vocabulary, you're building your vocabulary, and there's a level of interest and fun in it. Okay. When you're struggling with so many words, all you're doing is practicing decoding. It's not interesting because your short-term memory is used up with decoding.
Okay.
And it's not fun.
You're not getting a story necessarily.
No. So even if you're an older kid, you want to be 95% accurate. Now, if you're an older kid and you're really struggling reading, you don't want to read a baby book.
Right.
Okay. So then the way to become 95% accurate is with help. So maybe I'm going to read with you who is struggling reading, and as soon as you stumble on a word, I just feed it to you.
Okay.
So you're practicing the words you know, and I'm giving you the words you don't. So you're not stressing about the decoding. Okay. You're not stressing about the reading. And so I might be feeding you 15 words on a page. So we're reading and I'm going, decode, you know, and just quietly in their ear, and then they keep reading.
Okay.
And if they're reading out loud or if they're reading to themselves, they just point to it and you tell them.
Okay. That's a really great idea. And it's also a great time to bond with your child. I mean, reading together, it can be a really joyful activity and just a nice time too. Let's talk about reading out loud in general, because that is a very important skill and actually something even adults struggle with. So what's the best way to practice reading out loud with your child, and when should we do that? Talk to me about all of that.
So some kids love to read out loud. Great. Most kids love listening to books. You should be reading out loud to your kids forever if possible. Okay. I mean, even as an adult, I love to listen to stories. So, you know, continue to do that. Especially read the first part of a book out loud, because the first part is when you're not interested yet and you don't know the story setting and all that. Okay. But also, for kids reading out loud, have them pick their favorite part when they're reading to themselves, and have them just read that out loud to you. Something that they've already read, and then they just want to show you, oh, this was really interesting because I couldn't believe he did this. Listen to this, and have them read that part. Because what's really stressful about reading out loud is trying to decode, say the words out loud, and understand at the same time.
That's a really great idea, because your mind has already thought about the word, but if you're just at it fresh from the get-go, your mind hasn't had time to process, and you're making your mind and your mouth work all at the same time. So that could be very stressful.
So cold reading out loud is very stressful for most kids.
Yes. I like to read one page, as you mentioned, I like to read with my children one page at a time if we're going to do that, because it does seem to reduce the stress. They know that they only have to do half of it. Or when we were talking earlier, you mentioned, I asked, okay, what if you have kids who love to read, but then there are certain things they don't love to read, but they have to read? For example, the required book for the book report or something like that. What's the best way to approach that, to get them to do that?
Right, so if it's a required book, one way to approach it is just the independence route. You know, you're going to need to read, you know, Of Mice and Men for this book report for your, you know, how are you going to handle that? What's the best way for you to handle that? Now, the other way to do it is, if this is a child who reads well, then they don't need the practice reading. Okay. You could read it out loud to them. Okay. You could borrow it from the library on tape. Okay. Now, I'd never watch the movie instead, right. But listening to it on tape or you reading out loud to your child might be a more enjoyable way to hear that. Okay. And the other way to get kids to read those, a lot of times those required books, they're dealing with so much complicated literary structures, that if you read the Cliff Notes first and then read the book, it makes it so much of a richer read because you're looking for those things. Oh, now I'm looking for this theme and I'm spotting it successfully. And it feels so much more interesting and so much better because you're seeing all those things.
Yes, so they can almost be used as a support or a field guide to reading those more complicated books and topics. And then also when we were talking earlier, you mentioned history books, for example. If your child's a great reader and doesn't need to practice reading, why not read that section on the Revolutionary War or whatever it is out loud to them, and then it kind of becomes a story. I mean, it makes history more enjoyable. So.
And if they're not a good reader, and that's going to be really stressful reading, they're not going to understand it well because their short-term memory is used up in reading. So read it out loud to them in that case too. Practice reading a different time. With appropriate things.
That's a very good point.
You need to understand the Revolutionary War. I'm going to read it out loud and we're going to talk about it, and that's going to be much more conducive to learning about the Revolutionary War.
Okay, so let's talk about what kinds of books to have around the house, where to put them, or actually just reading materials in general. Let's and then also how do we make kids choose reading, even though kids love reading, versus electronics? Dun dun dun, the age-old question. So what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, we really need to think like marketers. We really need to think about, if I want my kid to love reading, then they need to walk into our home and see it all around them. They need to walk in, and the first thing they need to see are a bunch of books, face out, not spine out, because a spine isn't interesting. And it needs to be magazines, it needs to be comic books. Reading is where kids get vocabulary. Comic books have fabulous vocabulary in them.
So adjectives, a lot of adjectives and expressive language, yes.
And parents shouldn't worry about what their kids are reading. It can be comic books, it can be directions, it can be a cereal box, anything as long as they're reading. And so it should be all over, and it should be in comfortable spots, and they should have reading in the car so that when they're in the back seat and they have nothing to do, there's reading right there that's interesting. Reading in the bathroom, reading all over so that it's just always around. Make the electronics harder to get to. So don't, which is hard for a lot of us. And I kind of had to rethink my house when I kind of realized this. When you walk in, if the first thing you see is a television, it's pretty easy to plop down on the couch and click it on. For me too.
Yes.
And so if you move the television to the basement and you put the remote away in a high shelf in a drawer, so that it's just takes that many more steps to get there. And it's that much easier to plop down on the couch and pick up something to read.
Same concept as making healthy snacks easier to get at than sugary snacks. So I actually have one of the books we have here is one of my son's favorites, and I want to talk about this a little bit because this book is called Pick Me Up. And it's actually full. Every different page is kind of on a different topic, and it gives you a lot of little factoids on it. And I love this because it's like bite size, it's like snacking. It's a snack for readers. You can learn just a little bit about a topic. So, and then you've got great stories, you know, like Matilda by Roald Dahl, which is more involved reading. So I think offering a variety of different kinds of reading materials is also important.
And that's key because different kids are going to have different interests and different abilities to absorb big chunks of reading. And so a real big key is to go to the library, and if you can still find a children's librarian, they know so much, and you can say, my kid is this, and they'll give you a plethora of options. And also small bookstores, if you have small children's bookstores, those employees know everything that's out, and you know, now there's great graphic novels out, there's a lot of different choices. And that's going to be key, is finding where your kid's interest is. And it might be very different than your interest. So that's kind of hard sometimes for us parents.
I love that you bring up that about the library, because we are actually very fortunate in the community I live in to have an excellent children's librarian. And the programming there, a lot of people might not think about this. The programming that, if you can find a library that does offer programming, it's incredible. And they actually can take some of that burden off of you and introduce kids to reading and foster that love of reading too. Our local library has a boys book club, which actually has a collection of books that is geared towards topics that boys might enjoy or be drawn to. And it was a really successful program for my sons. So, well, you've shared so much with us today. Do you have anything else you want to add or
I would just
Closing
say
out?
keep reading out loud to your kids. It's such a bonding time and it's such a family time, and that's a way to introduce genres too, where,
Yes.
you know, as a teacher, I always try to get all the different genres in throughout the year, but as a parent, you know, before you go to bed or whenever is the best time, gather the family around, the whole family, mom, dad, kids, you know, and read, you know, a Roald Dahl book, read, you know, different kind of genres, and that's another way to just get them interested. The other way to trick kids who don't like reading is to read the first third of a very interesting book and then stop.
Yes. Oh, funny. I think that when you bring up the genres, what's really interesting and has worked well for my kids as well, if I say this was a favorite of mine when I was young, and then they want to learn more about you or why was that your favorite, and just talking through all of that with them too.
Yes.
So, Karen, you are such a wealth of information. We could talk about this for hours because actually reading is very near and dear to my heart. But I'm sure people must have a lot of questions, and there's a lot more you could say about the topics we've been discussing. Are you available online, or how would people find out more about the things you have to teach?
I am developing 2 websites. One is really geared towards parents and how to help their kids in school and reading and that kind of thing. And the other one is geared towards how to learn how to read.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And it was just really a pleasure. If you want to see more of this interview or learn more about the things Karen and I discussed today, visit our website.